The heat in Moab, Utah on August 12, 2021 was a physical presence. It shimmered above the blacktop of Highway 191, baked the red sandstone cliffs, and collected inside a white Ford Transit Connect van idling on a dusty pull-off. The light washing over it that afternoon wasn't only the relentless sun, it was also the strobing red and blue of a police cruiser. A witness had already called 911, reporting a man slapping a woman before both climbed into the van. When Officer Daniel Robbins approached the passenger side, the door opened to reveal a young woman in the midst of an emotional collapse, crying so hard she could barely breathe, her words fracturing into gasps. The desert air carried the sound of her distress, and the body cam mounted on Robbins' chest began recording every shaky syllable. The Moab police officer who responded to that call wrote in his report that Gabby Petito appeared to be the victim. Brian Laundrie was never detained, never charged, and drove away with her into the Wyoming wilderness. The system didn't fail to see the warning signs. It saw them, documented them, and let them go. Through the jostling, pixelated frame of that footage, we're introduced to her. Not as a name on a missing persons report, not as a face tiled across news websites, but as a living, trembling person in the immediate aftermath of a fight. Her hands are animated, her face flushed beneath streaks of mascara. She's trying to explain, to make sense of the conflict for the uniformed stranger before her. "I have really bad OCD," she tells Robbins, her voice thick with apology. "I was apologizing to him and saying, 'I'm sorry, I'm so mean.'" She frames herself as the problem, the instigator, the one whose mental state is the source of the turmoil. She absorbs the blame in real time, volunteering it to authority. She mentions that Brian, her fiancé, had grabbed her face during the argument, and then quickly pivots back to her own perceived failings, saying he didn't mean to hurt her. The officer notes small marks on her arm and her cheek. She minimizes them. Then the camera finds Brian Laundrie. He is seated on the curb, away from the van, calm where she is chaotic. He speaks in measured, complete sentences to the other responding officer, Eric Pratt, describing the argument as a dispute over the cleanliness of the van, characterizing Gabby as someone who just gets worked up sometimes. He says he was trying to de-escalate. Yeah, he admits to locking her out of the vehicle to stop her from driving off in an agitated state. His composure is stark. To a trained officer, that contrast in affect can be read in multiple ways: the rational party, the stabilizing force, the one managing a partner's emotional crisis. In the lexicon of street encounters, visible anguish can be mislabeled as instability, and calm can function as a performance of innocence. Laundrie's reasonableness effectively reframes the scene. The witness had described a man assaulting a woman. The man on the curb presents himself as the adult in the room. Robbins's written report, filed after the 75-minute encounter, contains a definitive notation. Petito was crying uncontrollably, and at no point in my investigation did Gabby stop crying, take a breath, and act normally. From my standpoint, she appeared to be the victim in this case. That language is not speculative. It is an official assessment, entered into the record in plain English. He saw it. He documented it. He identified the victim. This is not a story of clues missed. It is a story of clues catalogued and then set aside. Utah law on domestic violence calls was specific. A mandatory arrest was required if there was probable cause to believe an assault had occurred, or evidence of physical injury. The officers later stated they could not determine who the primary aggressor was. Petito's minimization of her injuries, her insistence that Laundrie hadn't meant to hurt her, created what they described as a legal grey area. No charges were filed. Instead, they enacted a separation protocol, a motel room for Laundrie, the van for Petito, Larsend, and a mutual understanding that both parties would cool off overnight. The intervention was a timeout given the name of an intervention. The red and blue lights faded, the dust settled back onto the roadside, and the white van remained. What the framework governing the pull-off was built to detect was physical evidence, the visible bruise, the broken skin, the clear statement of assault. What it could not process was the architecture of abuse that exists long before a hospital visit. Coercive control is not a single act. It is the slow erosion of self, the isolation, the manipulation of reality that leads a person to apologize for their own harm. The Moab footage has since become a national training resource precisely because it documents that erosion in real time. We see its product. A young woman so thoroughly enmeshed in a pattern of control that she claims ownership of the conflict, protects the person who hurt her, and offers her own psychology as the explanation. The officers were looking for a crime of violence. They were presented with evidence of a crime of control. The statutory threshold for the former was not met. The latter had no threshold at all. The van drove away from that pull-off with a future homicide victim who had just been officially identified as a victim, and the man who would kill her. Gabby Petito was alive on August 12th. She had 15 more days. Before she was a name on a missing persons report, before her face appeared on every major news platform, she was a girl from Long Island who loved the open road and believed, with what everyone who knew her described as an almost physical certainty, that the best version of her life was still ahead of her. Gabrielle Petito was born on March 19, 1999, in Blue Point, New York, a quiet hamlet on the south shore of Long Island, where the streets dead end into Great South Bay. Her mother, Nicole Schmidt, reached for uncomplicated language because uncomplicated language was all that fit. The most happy, positive person. A family friend offered a slightly different angle on the same truth, saying she had a light about her, and then added the detail that lifts it from eulogy into something specific. She was planning her whole future. Not waiting for it. Planning it. Actively, with the forward-leaning confidence of someone who had decided the future was hers to arrange. That quality, the planning, while the looking ahead, matters. It is not the profile of someone who had given up. It is the portrait of a 22-year-old woman in motion. On July 2nd, 2021, Gabby Petito and Brian Laundrie left Blue Point in a white 2012 Ford Transit Connect, pointing the nose of the van west and beginning what they had conceived as a cross-country journey. The kind of trip romanticized in a particular way in American culture. The open road as self-discovery, the van as both vehicle and declaration of intent. They were engaged. They had built this plan together, two young people from the same corner of the world deciding to move through as much of the rest of it as they could before whatever came next. It wasn't just travel, it was a project. Gabby was the one who documented it publicly. She ran an Instagram account at Gabs Petito and organised the journey under the hashtag #vanlife. What filled that feed was not simply scenery, it was her interpretation of scenery. The sweeping desert vistas and roadside diners, the improbable wildflowers growing through cracked asphalt, the small rituals of van life. She had an eye for the moment just before the postcard, the version of a landscape that felt discovered rather than photographed. Her captions carried the warmth of someone genuinely enchanted by where she was. Strangers checked in, not just for the landscapes but for her. The account grew. The millions of people who would eventually search her name had, in many cases, already spent time inside the world she had curated. The missing person was, to an unprecedented degree, someone the public had already met. What the Instagram feed could not contain was the private weather of the relationship. Photographs show what the photographer chooses to show, which is the most anyone's social media does. But the case eventually forced a question that had been sitting latent in the Van Life Project's very premise. What does it mean to document yourself this completely, in near real time? And what becomes of that documentation when something goes wrong? In this case, the answer was that it becomes evidence. the geotagged photographs, the timestamps embedded in image metadata, the comment sections capturing strangers' interactions with her, posts that established where she was on a given day, sometimes within a few miles. Her deliberate act of public self-creation was retroactively transformed into a forensic document. The personal became procedural. The joy she chose to share became a chain of evidence. Every photograph published in good faith, as self-expression, as the excited record of an ongoing adventure, was simultaneously creating a record that investigators would one day need. She had no way to know that. The digital world does not make that distinction. It stores everything, and when the structure of a life becomes the structure of an investigation, the intimacy of the original gesture gets reprocessed through a lens the person posting never consented to. The final Instagram post in her feed was published on August 25, 2021. The location was the Monarch Ghost Town in Utah, a historic mining site photogenic in the way that decay can become beautiful when the light hits at the right angle. Bright image, warm caption, another entry in a running story of adventure, me another landmark checked. Someone scrolling without context would have seen it as exactly that. The day before, on August 24th, Nicole Schmidt had a FaceTime call with her daughter. She listened to Gabby's voice, and what she heard beneath the reassurances did not reassure her. She described it later with precise, careful language. She was trying to reassure me, but mothers know. There was something in her voice. Not panic, not alarm, something. A quality detectable only through 22 years of proximity to a specific human being, an attunement no algorithm, no body cam, no official record could replicate. The something she heard was real. It had not survived translation into any documentable form. That FaceTime call on August 24th is the last confirmed instance of direct verbal communication between Gabby Petito and her mother. The next day she posted the Monarch Ghost Town photograph. On August 26th, no confirmed communication is recorded, and on August 27th for the last time she was seen in public. The air in Jackson, Wyoming on August 27th carried the specific thin chill of high altitude even in late summer. At the Merry Piglets restaurant on Broadway, witnesses would later describe an argument between Petito and Laundrie, a scene of escalating tension that spilled from their table into the public space before they left. The details are fragmented, filtered through the memories of strangers. The consequence is absolute. This is the last confirmed moment Gabby Petito was seen alive by anyone outside the van. A meal, an argument, an exit, a door closing behind them, and then the world shrinking down to the interior of the white Ford Transit Connect and the vast silent geography of northwestern Wyoming. They were in the shadow of the Tetons. The Bridger-Teton National Forest sprawls across 3.4 million acres, dense pine, rugged peaks, river valleys that swallow sound. Just east of the park boundary, accessible by unpaved road, is the Spread Creek Dispersed Camping Area, a place where visitors can pull off and stay for free, surrounded by nothing but forest and the creek's steady murmur. The forensic timeline later established suggests this is where they went next. This is where Gabby Petito's life ended. But on the afternoon of the 27th, that was not yet true. There were still hours, perhaps a day, where the story could have turned. The window was closing, it was not yet shut. What happened inside that window is the central agonizing mystery of the entire case. The period between the sighting at the Merry Piglets and Brian Laundrie's solo return to Florida on September 1st exists in the investigative record as a 5-day void. No verified credit card purchases, no eyewitness accounts made public, no social media posts from Gabby's accounts after the Monarch Ghost Town image. The digital trail, so rich and detailed throughout the journey, goes silent. That silence is punctuated by one anomalous signal. 2 days before the Merry Piglets, on August 25th, A text message was sent from Gabby Petito's phone to her mother. The wording, "Can you help Stan? I just keep getting his voicemails and missed calls." To an outside observer, it might read as a slightly confused request about a relative. To Nicole Schmidt, it was an immediate red flare. Gabby's grandfather was named Stan. She never called him by his first name, always Grandpa. The use of Stan was a breach of lifelong familial grammar. Furthermore, Schmidt has stated she was not bombarding her father with calls, making the stated reason for the text nonsensical. For the family, and later for investigators, this message became a critical data point suggesting the person typing on Gabby's phone on August 25th was not Gabby. Someone was attempting to mimic her communication and failing on a detail only her mother would catch. The text did not prove Gabby was already gone by the 25th, but it introduced a profound question about who was controlling her device and what that control implied. Then the silence resumed, deeper and more complete. On September 1st, at approximately 10:26 a.m., a white 2012 Ford Transit Connect passed through the license plate reader at the entrance to the Laundrie family subdivision in Northport, Florida. Brian Laundrie was alone. He drove the van, Gabby's van, registered in her name containing her belongings, into his parents' driveway. He unpacked. He went inside. He did not, according to all public records in the Petito family's account, inform Gabby's parents that she was not with him. He did not report her missing. He secured an attorney. For the next 10 days, the Laundrie family home became a sealed environment. Christopher and Roberta Laundrie communicated through their attorney. They did not, according to all public accounts, provide the Petito family with substantive information about Gabby's whereabouts. At some point in that window, the family took a previously planned camping trip to Fort DeSoto Park. They have said this was an attempt to support Brian and encourage him to speak about what had happened. They returned home. Brian then told his parents he was going for a hike in the nearby Carlton Reserve on September 14th and did not come back. The family did not report him missing until September 17th. While those 10 days passed in Northport, the Petito family in New York was descending into a private hell. They were calling, texting, receiving nothing that felt like their daughter. They were contacting the Laundries and meeting silence. Nicole Schmidt and Joseph Petito were faced with an impossible equation. Their daughter's fiancé was home with her vehicle without her and was offering no explanation. There is no law requiring a boyfriend or his parents to volunteer that information. The moral obligation operates on an entirely different plane. The distinction between these two planes is where public fury would later ignite and burn white-hot. The Laundrie family's decision to retain counsel and remain silent was, from a legal defense standpoint, rational. It was an exercise of constitutional rights. From outside, through the lens of a terrified family and a horrified public, it read as a profound betrayal, raising questions that still have no clean answer. What did they know, and when? What did Brian tell them? The family's attorney framed them as parents in a nightmare. The Petito family's experience framed them as the architects of a secondary agony. Both framings reflect something true, and neither resolves the other. So on September 11th, the Petitos could wait no longer. They contacted the Suffolk County Police Department and filed an official missing persons report. 10 days had elapsed since the van pulled into the Northport driveway. In the world of search and rescue, time is measured in hours. Those 240 hours between the van's arrival and the official report represent a canyon of lost opportunity. Time in which a crime scene grew colder, witnesses' memories grew fainter, and any possibility of a living Gabby Petito faded towards certainty. The report transformed a private family crisis into a jurisdictional matter and set the machinery of law enforcement into motion. The search began on September 11th. The clock had started ticking on September 1st. The missing persons report landed in a jurisdiction 1,800 miles from where everyone with a working theory already suspected. The last confirmed sighting of Gabby Petito was in Wyoming. The last known digital trace was a Utah campsite. Her van had come home from the west. Investigative weight shifted immediately, and the FBI, the Teton County Sheriff's Office, and partner agencies began translating a digital trail into physical geography. That geography does not yield easily. In the first week of September, the high elevations of the Bridger-Teton National Forest were already cold at night. The kind of cold that comes with a clarity of air that makes distances feel compressed, but does not make them shorter. Here, the Spread Creek dispersed camping area sits off a rough unpaved road where the nearest sound of another human being can be miles away. Volunteers who joined the search describe the quiet not as an absence of noise, but as a presence. In a search operation, silence means every sound you make returns unanswered. The official investigation moved on parallel tracks. On the ground in Wyoming, law enforcement worked search grids and followed the documented travel route backward through digital breadcrumbs. Simultaneously across the country, something unprecedented was happening online. Gabby had spent 4 months building a public archive of her own movements. Her Instagram account, her YouTube channel, the hashtag she used consistently. These were a near real-time geographic record. Followers who had interacted with her post remembered specific locations. Comment sections became reference databases. Amateur online searchers began cross-referencing geotagged metadata, identifying landmarks in image backgrounds, triangulating the sequence of campsites against publicly available campground records. People who had camped in the same areas, who recognized terrain from her posts, who had noted her plates at specific stops, surfaced information that sharpened the geographic focus. The crowd was enormous. In this specific instance, before the darker dynamics of public amateur investigation fully emerged, it functioned as a force multiplier. Still, Wyoming is not a problem that resolves from a keyboard. Search teams move through the Spread Creek area with the methodical rhythm that wilderness operations require. The terrain shifts between open meadow and dense riparian growth along the creek banks. Vegetation near the water thick enough to conceal what needs to be found within yards of a road already walked. On September 19th, search teams found human remains in Bridger-Teton National Forest, near the Spread Creek dispersed camping area. The location was consistent with where digital and investigative evidence had converged, within the geographic corridor of Petito and Laundrie's documented and inferred travel in late August. 8 days after the missing persons report was filed. 2 days later, on September 21st, the FBI confirmed what the family already understood the moment the call came. The remains were Gabby Petito. She was 22 years old. The manner of death, homicide. The cause of death, manual strangulation. And those 2 words carry a particular freight that other causes of death do not. Manual strangulation is not a crime of distance. It requires sustained, deliberate physical contact, continued effort over time as the person in front of you fights to survive. Forensic and medical research is consistent on this point. A victim does not lose consciousness instantly, and death does not follow instantly after that. The determination carries within it the shadow of a prolonged and terrifying final encounter. Domestic violence experts and forensic specialists who have addressed these findings in the broader literature on intimate partner homicide note that manual strangulation as a cause of death is disproportionately associated with escalating coercive control. The Moab traffic stop 2 weeks before her death had already produced an officer's documented observation that Petito appeared to be the victim. The September 21st finding retroactively illuminated what that August 12th encounter had suggested and what the system had not acted upon with sufficient urgency. The confirmation landed on a family suspended for 10 days in the airless space between hope and knowledge. Nicole Schmidt had already described what she heard in her daughter's voice on that final FaceTime call, had said that mothers know. The forensic report did not give her new information so much as convert her knowledge into an official document. If Gabby was no longer the one sending texts on August 25th, the confirmed cause of death raises the question of when exactly she stopped being able to. That the official record answers how, sustained, deliberate, but by hand, but does not answer precisely when is its own form of ongoing loss. Joseph Petito had stood before cameras during the search and asked for help from anyone who had information. His voice carried the specific register of a parent who is still asking questions because asking questions means the answer is not yet final. After September 21st, that register changed. His public statements became acts of grief performed in the open air, asking people to be inspired by Gabby, to help strangers, to carry something forward from her life rather than only from her death. It was the language of a man who had crossed from one country into another and was trying to find something he could hand people across the border. What the search could not recover, what 8 days in Wyoming silence could never recover, was the sequence. The hour-by-hour account of what happened between the restaurant in Jackson on August 27th and the moment the van pulled out of Wyoming without her. The forensic examination answered how. The investigation worked intensively on when, the why, the spoken words if there were any, the final exchange between two people in a van in the wilderness. That account was not in the trees near Spread Creek. It existed somewhere else, in a consciousness that had not yet been forced to give it. On September 14th, Northport Police designated Brian Laundrie a person of interest. Careful language, legally precise, communicating almost nothing to a public that had spent nearly 2 weeks watching a white van sit in a suburban driveway, while its driver said nothing, went nowhere public, and retained an attorney. And the designation moved the investigation into a new register. It did not move Laundrie. According to his family, he was already gone. 3 days before the designation was announced publicly, the Laundrie family had contacted police. On September 17th, they reported Brian missing, stating he had gone for a hike in the Carlton Reserve and had not returned. The precise day he had entered the reserve, if that is where he had gone, was not pinned down in a way investigators or the public could independently verify. That ambiguity was the structural problem on which the next 34 days would turn. The Carlton Reserve is not landscape that cooperates with searches. 25,000 acres of subtropical wilderness outside Northport, wetlands, dense palmetto scrub, sawgrass flats, yes, terrain where standing water rises and recedes with the season, and where the boundary between solid ground and swamp is conditional rather than fixed. In September, Florida's wet season means significant water. Trails accessible in winter become impassable. Areas searchable on foot in October are submerged in September. The FBI and local law enforcement deployed resources almost immediately after the missing person report. But the Carlton Reserve presented a fundamentally different operational challenge than Bridger Teton. Wyoming was vast, cold, and remote. Florida was dense, wet, and close to roads, close to populated areas, close enough to the interstate system that a person who wanted to leave could be in another state within hours. From very early, his investigators and commentators publicly questioned whether Laundrie was in the reserve at all. He had had a full week between his return to Northport and whatever departure his family later described. He had access to the van. He had Petito's belongings. Investigators would later confirm through debit card evidence that he had used a Capital One card linked to her account after her death. Transactions totaling more than $1,000. On September 23rd, 2 days after Petito's identity was confirmed and cause of death established as homicide, federal authorities issued an arrest warrant for Brian Laundrie. The charge, unauthorized use of another person's financial instruments, specifically using Petito's debit card to make purchases exceeding $1,000 after she was already dead. It was the only formal legal instrument ever filed in connection with her murder. The narrowness of that charge against the backdrop of what everyone understood to be true deserves a moment. The FBI had a confirmed homicide victim. They had a person of interest who had been in Wyoming during the relevant period, who had returned to Florida alone without her, who had immediately retained counsel, who was now formally missing. The federal arrest warrant they issued was for credit card fraud. The explanation, as investigators framed it publicly, was evidentiary discipline. You charge what you can prove with what you have at the moment you have it. You do not overcharge on an incomplete evidentiary record. But in public consciousness, and the legal precision of a debit card charge against the backdrop of a homicide felt like reaching for someone with the smallest possible hand. 34 days. That is how long the search for Brian Laundrie lasted from the date his family reported him missing to the date of his discovery. 8 days for Gabby Petito across 3.4 million acres of Wyoming wilderness. 34 days for Brian Laundrie across 25,000 acres of Florida swamp, less than an hour from his family's home. The Carlton Reserve's seasonal flooding had rendered portions of the search area physically inaccessible in the early weeks. As water levels dropped through October, submerged terrain became searchable. That hydraulic reality was documented and consistent with the timeline. It also meant 34 days of national attention focused on a single patch of subtropical scrubland, while the possibility that the person being searched for had simply driven away remained publicly unresolved. The daily absence of news from the reserve developed its own quality. A search with no discovery is not neutral information. It is accumulating uncertainty that takes different shapes depending on your priors. For investigators managing an active case, the reserve was one of several concurrent lines of inquiry. The sustained visible presence there was both genuine and, in retrospect, a reflection of the evidentiary dead end the case had reached. There was no stronger lead to follow publicly. October 20th arrived the way resolutions in this case had arrived throughout, not as a breakthrough but as an emergence. As water levels receded, areas previously submerged became accessible. Search teams working a section of the reserve that had been underwater made a discovery: partial human remains and a collection of personal belongings, among them a backpack and a notebook. The items were found in proximity to one another in an area that searchers had been physically unable to examine during high water periods. The location was inside the Carlton Reserve. Whether Laundrie had been there since the day his family said he left, or whether he arrived later, is a question the physical evidence, degraded by weeks of submersion and subtropical exposure, could not definitively answer. On October 21st, the FBI confirmed the remains were Brian Laundrie's. The cause of death, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Manner of death, suicide. That determination closed some things and foreclosed others. It ended the fugitive search. It removed the possibility of apprehension or incarceration, and it eliminated, with a finality the investigation's legal architecture could not work around, the possibility of a trial. A trial would have required the government to prove its case, sworn testimony, cross-examination, the presentation of physical and forensic evidence under oath in a courtroom. Even a guilty plea would have produced a formal legal finding of criminal responsibility, a sentence, a record. None of that happened. The federal debit card charge died with him. A homicide charge, which prosecutors had not yet filed when he died, ceased to be a procedural possibility. The only account of what happened in Wyoming between August 27th and September 1st, 2021, ended in a Florida swamp as partial remains beside a notebook. On October 23rd, reporting emerged that the notebook contained a written confession, an admission that Laundrie had killed Gabby Petito. The full contents have not been publicly disclosed. What has not been released includes the specific account of what happened, the sequence of events he described, the context he offered for a crime he would never be required to defend under cross-examination. The notebook is, in a legal sense, a document that cannot be tested. Its author cannot be questioned about its accuracy, its completeness, or the gap between what it says and what occurred. It is a unilateral account of a bilateral event written by the party with every incentive to frame the narrative in the way that served him. That is not to suggest the notebook is false. It may be the most accurate account of those final days that will ever exist. The point is structural. The adversarial legal process exists precisely to prevent a single party from becoming the final author of a narrative that ended someone else's life. Brian Laundrie, by dying before charges were filed, foreclosed that process entirely. The notebook sits as the case's last unread chapter, holding whatever he decided to say about what he did, in whatever terms he chose, accountable to no one. Nicole Schmidt never heard her daughter's final days accounted for in a courtroom. Joseph Petito never sat across the room from the person responsible while a verdict was read. The family received a forensic confirmation, an incomplete official timeline, a notebook whose full contents remain in a federal filing cabinet, and the permanent knowledge that the most complete account of Gabby's last hours exists in handwriting that will never face cross-examination. The bodycam footage from Moab is fossil. It preserves a moment in amber, the dust, the light, the exact sound of Gabby Petito's voice telling an officer she was apologizing for being mean. We watch it now, knowing what the officers on that shoulder did not, that the young woman crying in the passenger seat had 15 days left to live. That knowledge transforms the footage from a routine police report into an unbearable document. The question it generates, how could they have let him drive away with her, is human and understandable and ultimately leads to a dead end. To ask why an individual officer made a choice is to assume the system gave him better options. The harder inquiry is what the system was designed to see on August 12th and what it was designed to miss. Utah law provided a specific framework for that pull-off. Officers were required to make an arrest if they had probable cause to believe an assault had occurred or evidence of physical injury. The threshold was physical. What the Moab officers documented was emotional distress. Petito, visibly upset, admitting to slapping Laundrie. Laundrie with scratches on his face and arm, calmly stating he had not been assaulted. The officer's report contains the haunting notation that she appeared to be the victim. He saw it. He wrote it down. And then, because what he saw did not meet the statutory definition requiring mandatory arrest, or he used his discretion, he separated them for the night, arranged a hotel room, drove away. The system in that moment functioned exactly as written. It processed a disturbance, not a crime. It solved for de-escalation, not prevention, and in doing so, released a lethal variable back into the world. This encounter became a national case study precisely because it was not an aberration. It was a perfect demonstration of a documented structural blind spot in law enforcement protocol, the inability to recognize and act upon coercive control. Coercive control is not a bruise. It is a pattern, an architecture of isolation, intimidation, and psychological domination that often precedes physical violence. Its markers are behavioral: extreme anxiety in the victim, reflexive self-blame, a partner who appears hyper-rational in contrast to their distress. On the body cam, Petito apologizes profusely for her own meanness. She claims full responsibility for the conflict. Laundrie positions himself as the patient partner, merely trying to create distance. To an officer trained only to look for broken bones or bloody lips, this reads as a couple having a bad day. To a domestic violence expert, it reads as a coercive control indicator at an advanced stage. The officers were not trained or legally empowered to act on what an expert would have recognized. The Moab stop was just the first jurisdictional handoff in a case that would become a logistical maze. The incident occurred in Utah. The victim was a New York resident. The crime occurred in Wyoming. The sole person of interest lived in Florida. 4 states. Those are multiple agencies with their own protocols, their own databases, their own thresholds for action. The Moab police report existed in a file. It did not automatically surface in a national database when Petito's name appeared in a missing persons report weeks later. The information was siloed, trapped by geography and bureaucracy. The failure was not one of will, but of connectivity, a structural gap between the moment danger was recorded and the moment that recording might have mattered. The 10-day period between the van's return to Northport and the missing persons report generated its own category of institutional failure. Law enforcement defenders note that without a missing persons report, police authority was severely limited. Brian Laundrie was under no legal obligation to answer the door or speak to officers. He had the same constitutional rights as any citizen. The critique from policing reform advocates is not that Northport Police should have detained him illegally. It is that a young woman's travel companion returns home without her, in her vehicle, and immediately retains counsel. And no vigorous attempt was made in those 10 days to establish her whereabouts. The system was waiting for a formal report. It was passive by design. And the design cost 10 days. In the aftermath, the Moab footage entered police academies, advocacy training programs, and congressional discussions. Years of reform advocates argued for mandatory evidence-based training on the dynamics of coercive control, teaching officers to recognize the behavioral patterns of domination that precede physical violence and using validated risk assessment tools in every domestic disturbance call. They pushed for protocols that would mandate asking about isolation, threats, prior strangulation attempts, and extreme jealousy, shifting focus from a single incident to a pattern of behavior. The legislative push for broader legal definitions of domestic violence to include coercive control advanced in some states, though not uniformly. Training modules featuring Petito footage were incorporated into some academies. A nationwide standardized mandate or a seamless interstate database for domestic incident reports. Those systemic overhauls remain largely unrealized. The failure the Moab stop exposed was not operational, it was architectural. The machine processed that pull-off correctly according to its manual. The manual was insufficient, and the machine worked exactly as built in the 10-day gap in Florida too. At every node, the system performed its function. Its function was not designed to see danger accumulating in the spaces between jurisdictions, in the silence of a driveway, in psychological patterns that don't bleed. The warning signs was documented. The design did the rest. In the first 30 days after Gabby Petito was reported missing, her name appeared in more than 600,000 news articles, social media posts, and online discussions. On TikTok, the hashtag associated with her case accumulated billions of impressions. Not millions, billions. That figure is not a rhetorical gesture. It is a documented measurement of collective human attention large enough to resist ordinary comprehension. By standard audience metrics, this was one of the most watched missing persons cases in the history of American media. That number is where this conversation begins, not with a theory or a grievance, but with a fact about scale. Because the disproportion critics identified in this case is not an abstract sociological concern. It is a measurable gap between specific numbers, how much attention this case received, and how much attention comparable cases did not. The term for that gap has a name. Sociologist Gwen File is widely credited with coining the phrase missing white woman syndrome in the early 2000s, and it has since been analysed in peer-reviewed media studies, journalism ethics literature, and diversity advocacy scholarship. A 2016 analysis by Zach Summers, published in the journal Race and Justice, found that black women represented 34% of all missing women in the United States while receiving coverage in roughly 7% of missing women news stories. That is not a lean toward a particular demographic. It is a structural tilt so severe it constitutes a different category of visibility entirely. While Gabby Petito's face appeared on every major news platform in September 2021, the Fremont County Sheriff's Office in Wyoming, the very state where her remains were eventually found, was managing a high volume of missing persons cases involving Indigenous women, most of which attracted no national coverage. Across the country, researchers tracking the MMIW crisis, missing and murdered Indigenous women, documented dozens of active cases that September. No breaking news crawl, no emergency podcast episodes, no TikTok billions. The MMRSW crisis is not a fringe concern. It is a federally acknowledged epidemic. The US Department of Justice has confirmed that murder rates for Indigenous women on some reservations exceed the national average by more than 10 times. A 2018 analysis by the Urban Indian Health Institute found that in 71 American cities surveyed, there were 5,712 reports of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, yet federal databases captured only 116 of those cases. Women with names, with mothers, with futures they were building, disappearing, being killed, and being systematically excluded from the same protective machinery of public attention that was, in September 2021, focused with billion impression intensity on a single case. That is the concurrent reality. It does not diminish Gabby Petito. It contextualizes her. The mechanisms producing this disproportion are structural, and they operate through two engines running simultaneously. Inside a traditional newsroom, editorial decisions about which missing persons cases to cover are made through a framework of perceived audience identification. Editors and producers make rapid, often unconscious assessments about which victims their imagined audience will emotionally engage with. A young white woman documenting a romantic aspirational journey on Instagram is, within that framework, maximally relatable. She looks like someone's daughter, someone's college friend, someone who is doing something the target demographic aspires to or has done. A missing Indigenous woman from a Wyoming reservation does not arrive pre-equipped with that cultural hook in the same editorial calculus. Not because her life is less valuable or her loss less devastating, but because the newsroom's imagined audience has been trained by decades of coverage to recognize certain disappearances as the kind that matter. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Low coverage produces low engagement, which justifies low coverage, which produces an ever narrower definition of whose absence constitutes a story. Then the algorithm enters and amplifies. Social media platforms do not make moral judgments. They optimize for engagement, clicks, shares, watch time, emotional reaction. Once the Petito case achieved critical mass, every algorithm on every major platform worked to sustain and grow it. The more people engaged, the more the story was served to new users. The more it dominated feeds, the more other stories were displaced. The inequality was baked into the infrastructure, and it executed flawlessly. This analysis requires a specific kind of care here. The grief that Nicole Schmidt and Joseph Petito carried was real and absolute. When Joseph Petito stood before cameras and asked people to help a stranger, to smile at someone without expecting anything in return, he was doing the most human thing possible in an inhuman situation, trying to transform his daughter's death into something that would outlast it. The Petito family did not create the media environment that surrounded them. They were a family in agony, and the cameras arrived. The critique of missing white woman syndrome is not a critique of that family. It is a critique of the system that selected them as the face of a phenomenon belonging to thousands of other families. Families who made the same pleas into cameras that were already pointed elsewhere, who waited by phones that did not ring with media requests. In the weeks after the case peaked, several major news organizations published explicit analyses acknowledging the disproportion. Journalism schools incorporated it into curricula on media ethics and implicit bias. Advocacy organizations tracking MMIW cases saw brief, significant spikes in donations and media requests. What journalism academics and media critics observed in the aftermath was a pattern they recognized. A surge of institutional self-awareness that operated as its own news cycle, burning bright and brief before the underlying structural incentives reasserted themselves. The business model did not change during the moment of reckoning. The algorithm was not redesigned. The editorial frameworks that determine whose absence becomes a story were not surgically removed. When the next high-profile case broke, the machinery accelerated along familiar tracks. Academic voices in journalism ethics made a distinction worth sitting with. They separated structural reform from performative recognition. Performative recognition is what happens when a network airs a segment acknowledging missing white woman syndrome. During the same week, it runs 18 segments on a missing white woman. Structural reform would require explicit, enforceable editorial policies committing to proportional coverage. Policies that would cost networks audience engagement, which is to say policies that would cost them money. That kind of reform has not materialized at the institutional level with anything approaching comprehensiveness. What the Petito case accomplished, with unmistakable clarity, was make the disproportion visible in real time. The contrast was right there. MMIW statistics publicly available. Concurrent cases documented by indigenous advocacy groups naming names and sharing photographs on the same platforms where the Petito hashtag was accumulating its billions. The gap was not hidden. It was simply, for the most part, not the story. And the people whose job it is to decide what the story is had to sit with what that revealed about them. The honest accounting at the end of this is not comfortable for anyone consuming this content, including the person producing it. Every listen, every click, every algorithm satisfying engagement with this documentary is itself a data point in the very system being described. The attention economy does not excuse listeners from participation, it implicates them in it. The question is not whether that attention is shameful. Grief for Gabby Petito is legitimate, as interest in the failures that permitted her death is legitimate. The question is whether that attention can be held alongside an active consciousness of who else is missing and what the silence around their names costs. Before the FBI had assembled a full investigative timeline, the internet already had one. That is not a metaphor. In the days following the September 11th missing persons report, tens of thousands of people who had never met Gabby Petito and held no law enforcement credentials opened her Instagram account and began working. They scrolled backward through her posts, cross-referenced geotagged photographs against satellite maps, matched image backgrounds to publicly available terrain data, and consulted one another in Reddit forums and Discord servers, building a distributed volunteer timeline that in several documented instances aligned precisely with the investigative geography authorities were already pursuing. Investigators working the case have publicly acknowledged that digital evidence from Petito's social media provided critical anchor points for reconstructing the route. The public's engagement meant connections were surfaced faster than a small investigative team could have managed alone. Comment section witnesses, people who had interacted with the couple at stops along the route, who recognized locations from their own travels, formed an informal witness network that a pre-social media investigation could not have accessed in any comparable time frame. It was, as a law enforcement tool, almost accidental. Petito had not documented her journey as evidence. She documented it as life, as the curated, joyful public face of an adventure she was living and sharing. The investigative value was an unintended byproduct of a personal project, and the precedent it set is significant and largely unexamined. Investigators now understand that in cases involving victims who maintained active social media presences, the victim's own digital archive may constitute the most detailed and temporally precise evidence trail available. Geotagged photos carry embedded metadata. Timestamps reflect real-time activity. Follower interactions produce witnesses. Stories and reels, once posted, are cached in ways that survive deletion attempts. The evidentiary richness of a well-maintained public account is extraordinary, and the legal questions it generates are ones the system has barely begun to formalize. Whose consent governs that evidence? What happens to that archive after death? At what point does personal expression become public property in the service of a criminal investigation? The Petito case made these questions concrete. They remain largely unresolved in both law and policy. But the same qualities that made public engagement investigatively useful made it a machine capable of doing real harm. The speed with which online communities form theories and pursue them is not calibrated to legal standards of evidence or to basic considerations of human cost. In the weeks following the missing persons report, multiple individuals were falsely identified across social media platforms as persons of interest. People with ordinary incidental contact with Petito and Laundrie, a restaurant employee, a campground host, or a traveller who had posted nearby, found themselves named in threads with thousands of participants, their addresses located, their employers tagged, their families contacted. The platforms on which this happened enforced no meaningful accountability. The accounts propagating false information faced no legal consequence. The people harassed had no rapid recourse. The harassment was documented and real, and for some of those individuals it lasted well beyond the period of active public interest. This is the shadow side of crowdsourced investigation, and it operates on a specific logic. Online true crime communities are built around the pleasures of pattern recognition, the satisfactions of amateur deduction, and the social rewards of being early to a conclusion. That incentive structure does not produce caution. It produces speed. And speed without accountability produces collateral damage. The community that helped locate Petito's movements and the community that harassed innocent bystanders were not cleanly separable. In many cases they were the same people, drawing on the same attention, using the same platforms, operating through the same algorithms. Then there is what built itself around the case commercially. Within weeks of the remains being confirmed, the true crime content infrastructure had fully engaged. Podcast episodes numbered in the hundreds. YouTube channels generating millions of views appeared from accounts that had never covered a missing persons case before and have not since. Documentary interest from streaming services was reported before the investigation had formally concluded. Each of those podcasts ran advertising. Each YouTube video monetized through the platform's revenue-sharing model. The story of Gabby Petito's murder was generating revenue for people who had no relationship to her, no investigative role, and no accountability to her family. Critics in journalism ethics, media studies, and victim advocacy have argued explicitly that this constitutes exploitation, that the true crime genre, regardless of the stated intentions of its practitioners, structurally transforms human tragedy into entertainment product, and that the transformation itself is the harm, independent of whether the content is accurate or sensitively produced. They make a specific and uncomfortable argument about format, that the very qualities making true crime narratively compelling, the pacing, the reveal structure, the intimacy of first-person narration, the building of suspense, are aestheticizations of real suffering. That when you score a moment of forensic discovery with music, or use cinematic storytelling to recreate a victim's last known movements, you're making an aesthetic choice that serves the audience's experience before it serves the victim's dignity. That the genre cannot, by its nature, hold both simultaneously. This is not a fringe position. It deserves to sit here without being argued away. This documentary exists within the landscape it is describing. That is not a comfortable sentence to narrate, but it is the honest one. The format you are listening to, the intimacy of the voice, the movement from evidence to consequence to emotional weight, is exactly the format those critics identify as the site of the ethical problem. A rigorously factual treatment differs from a sensationalized one in degree. Whether it differs in kind is a question this script cannot answer from inside itself. It requires the person listening to hold it, which is a different kind of responsibility than following a narrative. What the official record closed is knowable in precise terms. On October 21, 2021, the FBI confirmed that partial human remains recovered in the Carlton Reserve belonged to Brian Laundrie. He died by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Beside his remains, a backpack and a notebook, reportedly containing an admission that he had killed Gabby Petito. The federal arrest warrant, the only formal legal instrument ever filed in connection with her death, charged him with credit card fraud and died with him. There was no indictment for homicide, no trial, no verdict, no sentence. The case concluded without a single sworn word spoken under oath about what happened in Wyoming in the final days of August 2021. What the administrative machinery closed, the Petito family cannot close. There is a particular quality to grief when the only person who could answer your questions made himself permanently unavailable. It is different from the grief of a wrong verdict, different from the grief of a cold case that stalls in evidence gaps. Those forms of loss at least preserve the theoretical possibility of a future accounting. What the Petito family holds is a case that, by every legal definition, is resolved, and by every human measure, is not. The notebook exists. Its full contents are not publicly disclosed. Whatever Brian Laundrie wrote in that final document, what he admitted, what he explained or chose not to explain, what he included and what he omitted, remains in the custody of investigators. The only account of Gabby Petito's last hours is the one her killer wrote for himself, on his own terms, with no one left to contest a single word of it. Nicole Schmidt said that on the last FaceTime call her daughter was trying to reassure her, and then she said, "Mothers know." There was something in her voice. She heard it. She could not name it in the moment, could not translate it into action, could not reach through a screen and 1,000 miles of interstate and pull her daughter out of whatever was already unfolding. The evidence caught up to her weeks later and confirmed what she already understood. That sequence, truth arriving in the body before it arrives in the record, is its own form of loss. She knew and could not stop it. There is no legal proceeding and no judicial finding that resolves that. The concrete legacy of this case is real and deserves to be named precisely. The Moab body cam footage became a documented training resource for law enforcement, cited in professional development curricula and academic context to illustrate the behavioral markers of coercive control as distinct from acute physical violence. The national conversation about coercive control as a pre-physical phase of intimate partner abuse measurably advanced. Advocacy organizations reported spikes in public engagement with their materials. Legislative conversations about mandatory domestic violence training and clearer intervention thresholds were renewed with specific reference to the Moab encounter. Whether those conversations produced durable structural reform is the harder question, and the honest answer is incompletely. The conversation was advanced. The architecture it was supposed to change mostly held. The media bias debate this case crystallized has similarly produced more documentation than transformation. The concept of missing white woman syndrome existed before Gabby Petito's name became a headline. After it, the concept entered mainstream discourse with a visibility it had not previously commanded, and the gap between that visibility and actual newsroom reform has been the subject of sustained criticism ever since. The case did not solve the disproportion. It made it undeniable to an audience that had previously been able to look away from the data. That is a different thing, worth something, and not enough. The precise events of late August 2021 in the Bridger-Teton National Forest remain what they have always been, an open interior that the official record rings but cannot enter. The FBI established cause of death, location of remains, the geographic relationship between her body, and the documented travel route. The notebook reportedly tells something, but not everything, and not publicly. What Laundrie's specific movements were in the days between August 27th and September 1st, the route he drove, what happened between the last confirmed sighting at the Merry Piglets and the moment the van appeared in a Northport driveway without its other occupant, exists only in documents not yet disclosed, and in the consciousness of a man no longer alive to be questioned. That is the permanent condition of this case. It does not soften with time. Gabrielle Petito was born March 19, 1999, in the ordinary way every human being arrives, not as a symbol, not as a case study, not as a test of institutional failure or media ethics, but as a person. She grew up in Blue Point, New York. Her mother says she was the most happy, positive person. A family friend said she was planning her whole future. Those observations read as genuine if you look at her posts before the case makes you look at them differently. The enthusiasm that's not only performed, the joy she took in motion and open sky, and the specific freedom of a road that hadn't ended yet. She left on July 2nd with a van and a person she was going to marry, and a future she was genuinely excited to build. What she's remembered as publicly is the circumstances of her death, or that is the reduction this documentary cannot fully undo. The vocabulary available for a young woman murdered by her partner in Wyoming in August 2021 is organized around the murder, the partner, and Wyoming. The woman who made FaceTime calls home and chose which photographs to share and laughed at something in the passenger seat. That woman is present only in fragments, refracted through forensic and investigative necessity. Her family knows who she was. The people who loved her know. The public, which now knows her name with great confidence, knows far less than it believes it does. Her father asked people to help a stranger. That is what he is left to give. On August 12th, 2021, 2 officers drove away from a pull-off on the edge of Moab, Utah. They had documented, in their own words, that Gabby Petito appeared to be the victim. They had processed the encounter through a system built to handle domestic disturbances and reached the conclusion the system made available to them. Separate the couple, issue no charges, drive away. The system functioned as designed. The design was insufficient. That sentence, the system saw the warning signs, documented them and let them go, was true on August 12th. It was true again on September 1st, when a van came home without a passenger and 10 days elapsed before anyone with authority required an answer. It remains true not as a historical statement about a concluded case, but as a description of the infrastructure that exists today for women in relationships with people who will eventually kill them. The Moab body cam footage is a training tool now, and it should be, and that is not enough. The cases with no camera are the ones this documentary cannot tell. The missing persons reports filed in counties that generated no national coverage, where no Instagram grid existed to crowdsource a timeline, where no volunteer searchers came. The question this case cannot close, the one its very visibility makes inescapable, is the question of what those cases cost and who paid, and who is still paying, and whether the attention we gave to this one was ever really in the service of building something that protects them. That question has no documentary ending. It has only the weight of what comes after listening.